A propriedade privada é sagrada. Uma ideia simples, mas que deve guiar todo o nosso entendimento de realidades políticas e sociais. Essa é a teoria do professor Walter Williams, economista da Universidade George Mason, na Virgínia. Para ele, o livre mercado é o melhor instrumento regulador de qualquer tipo de relação, seja humana ou mercantil. Segundo ele, quanto menos interferência do governo, em qualquer área, melhor. Uma prisão indevida, ou a tortura, por exemplo, ele vê como atentados contra um tipo de propriedade privada, o seu corpo. A repressão política ameaça outras propriedades, como o direito à livre expressão e à livre associação. Com esse mesmo raciocínio, Williams questiona os resultados e a eficácia das chamadas ações afirmativas e das cotas raciais nos Estados Unidos, que começaram a ser implementadas no fim dos anos 60, durante o governo de Richard Nixon. Ele vai além. Diz que os negros dos Estados Unidos, ele é contra o uso do termo afro-americano, se prejudicam porque essas ações afirmativas reforçam os estereótipos raciais e desestimulam a iniciativa própria. Com fama de encrenqueiro quando jovem, o professor Walter Williams se rebelou contra a obrigatoriedade de servir ao exército. Foi parar na corte marcial por ter sido um dos primeiros a questionar as leis Jim Crow, um conjunto de leis segregacionistas que vigoravam no sul dos Estados Unidos até 1964, antes de serem suspensas pelo famoso Ato dos Direitos Civis. Foi esse ex-encrenqueiro, hoje respeitável senhor de 74 anos, que recebeu a equipe do milênio em sua sala, na Universidade George Mason.
Professor Williams,
Yes.
when you were a private in the United States Army, you were an activist against Jim Crow. You wrote letters to the White House. Why did you do that?
Well, I've always been a radical, and I've always valued individual liberty. And what I saw as, this is like in 1959, and I was sent to Fort Stewart, Georgia, which is in the southern part of the United States, and there was gross discrimination, and I felt I had to take it on.
Good results, bad results. I think you almost got court-martialed because
No,
of
I
that.
did get court-martialed, but I won. Yeah, they set me up. I was quite a troublemaker, and so they framed me, and so. But however, I had some evidence, and I made a fool out of the company commander, who indeed brought court-martial charges against me.
What was your argument, not only against the commander, but what was your argument in the letters?
Well, my argument was, essential argument was, is that what obligation do I owe to defend the country if I do not have the same rights as everybody else has? And that was essentially the argument. And I saw that I did not have the same constitutional guarantees as everybody else did, and I wanted to know what was my obligation in light of that.
You were a distraction. You were a problem for your superiors.
Yes, I was a troublemaker. And then, but however, I was drafted. Matter of fact, I don't call it a draft. I call it a confiscation of labor services. That is, I was driving a taxi cab in Philadelphia, making good money, $400 a month, which was very good in 1959, and then I got a letter which essentially said you're going to stop making $400 a month and start making $68 a month. And normally people don't switch voluntarily in that direction, so they're just taking my labor services.
You have, for many years, defended the theory that laws of affirmative action actually started with Lyndon Johnson, 65, if I'm not wrong.
No, actually, no. No, it started with Richard Nixon in 1968. Richard Nixon pushed that was the first time we had affirmative action legislation written in our country.
First executive order wasn't in
No. We didn't call it affirmative action. Affirmative action arose during the Nixon administration.
You grew up in Pennsylvania,
In Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia, in a poor neighborhood.
Yes.
You grew up during the Jim Crow laws. the discrimination against blacks in the United States was pervasive. It lasted forever and essentially prevented many segments of the black population from having the tools necessary to advance. You don't think that giving those tools as an advantage is correct?
No, I don't. No, I don't. And matter of fact, I think that one thing that people need to realize is that if you look at black Americans today, that is, if you just thought of black Americans as a separate nation, we would be, if you looked at what we produce each year, our income, we would be the 14th or 15th richest nation that faces Earth. Some black Americans are some of the richest people in the world. Some are the most famous people in the world. And it was a black American who was the commander-in-chief of the mightiest army in the world, namely Colin Powell. And now we have a president. Now, the point is, the significance of this is that if you go back to 1865, when the Civil War was over, neither a slave nor a slave owner would have believed that this kind of progress would have been possible in a little bit over 100 years.
Now,
and that speaks well of a nation where these gains were possible. They would not have been possible anywhere else in the world, and it speaks very well of the intestinal fortitude of a people who made these gains.
So let's take your timeline. Nixon,
Yeah.
the beginning of affirmative action. The progress made by blacks from the end of the Civil War until the Nixon administration in the 70s, and the progress made from the Nixon administration to today. Was the progress better, bigger, before affirmative action?
Well, there's a colleague of mine, Finus Welch, and he's done extensive work researching here, and he points that the progress that black Americans made from 1940 to 1960 was greater than the progress that blacks made between 1960 and 1980. What was necessary was to get rid of the most abusive discriminatory laws. It was not discrimination. For example, blacks, at one time, blacks were not in basketball at all, professional basketball. Today, blacks are 80% of the players. They were not in football. Today, they're 60% of the players. And it was not affirmative action.
Now,
it was just being very, very good.
Now, see this from the point of view of the argument. Mm-hmm. We're talking about physics ability that define a genetic progression.
Mm-hmm.
Well, genetic progression, it's a different progression than economic opportunity progression, intellectual progression. So when you talk about the fact that without affirmative action, mm-hmm. blacks have done very well in some fields like basketball, mm-hmm. isn't that a little different from doing well in a field?
If you look at the question, you say, look, you add up the amount of earnings that black Americans earn each year, and it's very significant. We'll be the 14th or 15th richest nation in the world if you just thought of us as a nation. That is a tremendous gain, and I doubt whether you can attribute it to affirmative action.
You would eliminate it today, quotas and all?
Yes, I would, because I think that there's, well, number one, I think that quotas themselves are unfair. But number two, they don't act in the favor of the people who are so-called beneficiaries of quotas. That is, for example, many colleges have quotas, and so what they do, like Harvard and Yale and MIT, they recruit black people to their school, black students, and these are high-powered schools, and many times the black students flunk out because they cannot compete. And if they came to some other school that was not as high-powered, they would get through. And so a lot of times affirmative action works against the people who are said to be beneficiaries of it.
If I don't have a school when I'm a kid, if I don't have a high school later on, or a college to go to, how could I compete? Isn't that fair that I have some... I mean,
well, if you look at just, I'm not telling everybody look at my life, but if you look at my life, I grew up. I was born in the middle of the Depression, the Great Depression of the country, gross discrimination, and the way that I was able to compete with my colleagues is that, let's say when I went to UCLA, I got my doctorate at UCLA, and UCLA was ranked number 10 in terms of quality of schools in the country. What it meant is that because my education wasn't as good as the other guys there, it meant that I had to work harder. That is, I had to study longer. But I didn't get any special favors. I just studied, you know, like maybe a guy who had a rich family, who went to middle class schools, maybe he got his assignment done in an hour. And maybe it took me 5 hours to do the same assignment. But the bottom line was it was done.
In Brazil, black origins are a majority in the population. They don't get any breaks. Do you think that this is the way it's supposed to be?
Well, I think that instead of breaks, I say that what people need is opportunities. That is, for example, there are many laws and regulations, and I don't know all of them in Brazil, but there are many laws and regulations that cut off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. Just for one example, in New York City, in order to get a license to own and operate one taxi, in May 2007, such a license sold for $600,000.
Yeah.
And so you say, what is the effect of a law that creates such a license? It cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. It stops anyone who does not have that kind of money or bank finance of getting into the cab business. Minimum wage laws, Davis-Bacon like in the United States, laws that set minimum wages, it discriminates against low-skilled people getting a hold onto the economic ladder. So what I propose for people, not only in the United States, but around the world, is that we have a free enterprise system, voluntary, peaceable exchange.
And you don't think that anybody would argue or counter-argue that affirmative action helped that?
If affirmative action did not help that. Affirmative action did not. That is, if you again, you're going back to the statistics. You do a before and after on affirmative action. You see the progress and the gains that blacks made were greater before affirmative action than after.
You are a firm proponent of laissez-faire in economy.
Yes.
We have a vast deregulation of the financial system in the 90s and the 2000s, as a matter of fact. In 2008, there was an enormous crisis because there was no control of the securities that were backed by mortgages and so on and so forth.
If I might interrupt you, that was caused by government, by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all these agencies, and government regulations in our countries that force banks to make loans to people that they otherwise would not have made loans to. It was the so-called Community Reinvestment Act to enable more poor people to be homeowners. They forced banks to make loans to people that the banks would not have voluntarily made loans to, and that's a large portion of the so-called subprime crisis in our country.
But it was not an obligation; it was an option.
Oh no! They told the bank, if you're a banker, they said, look, if you want to open another branch, if you want to get permission to open another branch in the bank, you have to show us that you've made loans to poorer people or black people or minorities. You have to prove to us that you've made loans. And it was kind of blackmailing the banks. And the banks were willing to take that kind of risk because they knew that the government would bail them out.
You believe that the crisis in 2008 was not caused by deregulation?
It was caused by government. That most crises, economic crisis you see in our country and around the world is caused by government. That is, it's government regulations.
The deregulation that you propose is pretty widespread, including in terms of freedom of speech, civil rights. You don't see the need to regulate any of that.
Well, I think that the kind of regulations that one should have is those kind of regulations and laws that prevent me from forcing you to do things that you don't want to do. That is, there should be laws to stop me from robbing you. There should be laws to stop me from engaging in fraud, and so far as my fellow man. But laws that restrict and regulate peaceable voluntary exchange, I'm against.
You, for instance, see no need to have any anti-discrimination regulations or laws or whatever you have it in a place that receives no public money.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Because
So I am free to discriminate
Yes.
if I have my company?
Well, because I so value freedom of association. And when you say you believe in freedom of association, you have to be a person to allow people to be free to associate in ways that you find despicable. That is the true test of one's commitment to
The Ku Klux Klan was a free group of associates.
They engaged in violence. They engaged in violence. They were killing people.
Right.
I'm against that. I said, I believe people ought to have the right to engage in peaceable voluntary exchange.
On that reasoning, you're parting from the principle that the person who is using the freedom of speech to say things you hate will just do that and stay there. What if that person, the objective is an entirely different one, is to use the freedom of speech to then later on limit your freedom of speech?
Well, that's wrong. That's wrong. That
But
should
it
not be
happens.
allowed. That should not be allowed. And for example, think about this kind of discrimination. Would you allow it if you were the governor or the president? When I was choosing a wife to marry in 1960, I did not give white women an equal opportunity to marry me. I didn't give Brazilian women equal opportunity to marry me. I discriminated and kept my choices to black women. Should I be able to freely associate that way?
Yes, you should.
Okay, that's discrimination. Evidently, what I'm suggesting is that discrimination, racial discrimination, would tend to die in and of itself unless it's backed by some kind of law. How moral is it for one to say, look, let's help individual D today by punishing individual C today for what individual A of yesterday did to individual B of yesterday. Now, what I mean there is that let's punish, you're saying, let's help a black today by punishing a white of today for what a white of yesterday did to a black of yesterday. That's not a very, very good system for me. And by the way, I might add that Brazilian blacks, they should be far ahead of American blacks.
Why aren't they?
Well, I think because they're not, the society in Brazil is not as free.
Of course not. Discrimination still exists.
No, I don't mean that sense. I mean,
it is true.
Well, yes, but I mean in terms of regulation of economic activity.
Discrimination is insidious. It doesn't need to be in the laws. It doesn't need to be written. It just needs to be exercised. It exists in Brazil, has always existed.
Well, I understand that it exists everywhere. It exists in the United States. But I'm saying that economic liberty lessens the pressure of racial discrimination. That is, for example, when people are able to make laws regulating, as I gave you the example of the taxi cab industry, when they're able to make laws, well, then that strengthens racial discrimination. But if you say, look, anybody can get in the cab business who wants to.
Because one could understand your information by saying, I don't know, Brazilian blacks are lazy. Why they didn't do so well?
I wouldn't give that as a reason.
Why would it be?
Well, as I just said, because of the economic regulation, that is the lack of economic liberty in Brazil. That is traditional with Brazil.
Economic freedom is, in your opinion, the way.
Yes, yes. And if you look around the world, and you say, if you were to rank people, you go to the International Amnesty, and rank countries according to economic and human rights protections, if you rank countries according to per capita income, you would find the greatest wealth at those countries that have the greatest free market system, and the poorest at the socialist or the communist end of the economic spectrum. And you say, well, how come Chile is richer than most other countries in South America? It's because not that they have great political freedom under Pinochet, they had greater greater economic freedom. And if you say, how come South Korea is richer than North Korea? It's because they have greater economic. How come West Germany was greater than richer than East Germany? It's because they had greater economic freedom.
You have a black president in the United States, first time. Is he going to be a success in the post?
I don't believe so.
Why not?
I believe he's going to be like Jimmy Carter. It's going to be a failed presidency, and I think that's not very good for the first black president.
Why is it going to be a failure?
Well, if you look at the health care pill that nobody wants, that very few Americans want. If you look at our position in foreign diplomacy, and if you look at the economic problems that the president is dealing with.
What about the economic problems he inherited?
Well, but you can only use that excuse for so long.
You mean to say that if you give me a house that's half destroyed, after 6 months I cannot argue that the house is half destroyed?
That's just like people all around the world blaming colonialism for their problems. People in third world countries saying, oh, it's colonialism. They're just looking for excuses. If you look back during the Roosevelt administration, the New Deal made the Great Depression far worse than it would have been.
The second term of FDR's presidency, this was the richest country in the world coming from the biggest depression. So it might have made matters far worse, and then you had this country in 1942 was already the richest country in the world. It was the same president that you say made matters much worse.
Well, yes, he did. He heightened the most economists who study the 1930s. They say, well, without the New Deal, and also Herbert Hoover's last year, the Depression would have lasted 3 years. It would have been a very, very sharp downturn, but he turned it into an affair that did not end until 1945 or 1946.
Isn't this a little bit of armchair coaching?
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Look, if you look at our country from 1787, its inception, until today, until 1930 rather, nobody thought that the federal government ought to be involved in the economic affairs of the country. And it was not until 1930s when the federal government got involved and made the situation worse.
If I remember correctly, in 1929 there was a big debacle in Wall Street, and the country all of a sudden found itself. That's just plain not true. The stock market crash in 1929 had nothing to do with depression. Nothing.
What caused it? And it was the acts by the Federal Reserve Bank.
After the crash?
No. It was in the late 30s. Late 20s, early 30s. If you look in 1987, we had a massive stock market crash in our country.
It was a big one.
It was no depression. Stock markets and depression, they don't go together. I believe the greatest input to the welfare of mankind is personal liberty.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Se você quiser saber mais sobre essa entrevista, entre no blog do Milênio, no site da Globo News.